welcome to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum, Oregon's premier public affairs forum. I'm Sharon Van Sickle Robbins, City Club President, and I would like to welcome you all, those of you here today at the Governor Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB or KBPS radio or watching on Portland Community Media's CityNet 30. Thank you for joining City Club today on Friday, July 23rd for this week's Friday Forum. Today we will hear from two representatives of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde about tribal environmental stewardship. But first, some announcements. In consideration of those sitting close to you and those in our radio and television audiences, please silence your cell phones now. If there are any members here who have joined City Club recently or who are here with us at a Friday Forum for the first time, please stand and let us give you a warm welcome. As always, we offer our appreciation to those whose generous financial backing makes our time-honored City Club luncheons possible. Please join me in offering an appreciative round of applause to the Don Sterling City Club Fund and the Goldie Family Designated Fund, both of the Oregon Community Foundation. We greatly appreciate your support. If your company or firm would like to be a City Club sponsor, please contact City Club staff at the back of the room or call the City Club offices. In addition to Friday forums, City Club hosts many other events throughout the year, such as our Citizen Salon series. This dinner and discussion series brings together good food and great conversation while at the same time supporting the vital mission of City Club. We invite you to join us for upcoming salons where there will be provocative evenings exploring a year in the life of Roosevelt High School with provocateur Oregonian columnist Steve Dean, and whether Sarah Palin is the future of the Republican Party with provocateur Melody Rose, chief of the Political Science Department at Portland State. Please join us July 30th for our final forum before our August break. We will be celebrating the Portland Bridge Festival with a forum to discuss the state of Portland's bridges and whether we need a regional bridge authority to ensure that, unlike London bridges, they don't fall down. And now to today's program. The Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde adapt traditional values to modern society by working to preserve and enhance their ancestral lands, which encompass much of Western Oregon. Through restoration work on reservation land and partnerships with community organizations, the Grand Ronde also strive to improve salmon and animal habitat more generally in the Pacific Northwest. Today, two representatives of this tribe will discuss what the Grand Ronde are doing to promote culturally informed land and forestry management. Our first speaker today is Cheryle Kennedy. Cheryle is the tribe's chairwoman and is currently serving her 4th consecutive term on tribal council. She's the second longest serving tribal chairperson in post-restoration Grand Ronde history. Her other political activities include acting as the current commissioner on Oregon's Commission on Indian Services and serving on the Oregon Health Improvement Plan Board. Before being elected to tribal council, Cheryle worked for 30 years as a Grand Ronde health administrator, including serving as the tribe's health director for almost 15 years. Our second speaker today is Lisa Bluelake. Lisa has been a staff attorney for the Confederated Tribes for almost 10 years. Lisa's work covers a variety of legal issues affecting the tribe, including environmental issues both on and off the tribe's reservation. Prior to working for Grand Ronde, Lisa was Assistant General Counsel for the Hopi Tribe in Arizona. Lisa also is the past chair of the Oregon State Bar Indian Law Section Executive Committee. And now please help me welcome today's first speaker, Cheryle Kennedy.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Cheryle Kennedy. I'm the chairwoman of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. I'm pleased to be here and to see so many people, and some that I know here in the audience. I want to acknowledge some of our staff who are also here with us today. Siobhan Taylor, who is our Public Affairs Officer, and Dean Rhodes, who is the editor of our Smoke Signal newspaper. I was pleased to meet a few of you a little earlier. Thank you for coming up and saying hello. I just want to cover a little of our history today and the historical ties that we have to the land which was once known as the Oregon Territory. A little bit about Grand Ronde. We're located approximately 65 miles from here. Our membership is approximately 5,600 members, and our headquarters is located at Grand Ronde. We are the largest tribe in the state of Oregon. Today we're here to talk about the connection that the Confederated Tribes has to these lands and how we've dealt with them. For thousands of years, peoples who now comprise the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde lived here in Western Oregon. At that time, there were no boundaries. Our peoples lived on both sides of the Columbia River. Our villages are being even yet discovered today along those shores. We also were down as far as Northern California. Our tribes are composed of the Umpqua, the Rogue River, the Kalapuya, the Shasta, and the Molallas. The peoples were a mighty people. For thousands of years, we lived here before European contact. The place was very plenteous in foodstuffs and the offerings that the Creator had granted to us. He was very, very good to us. We were the original plank house people living in a land that had the subsistence to meet all of our needs, the foodstuffs, the medicines, all of the implements, the resources for us to be successful. Our main method of travel was by canoe. At that time, the rivers and the streams were our highways, our waterways. We walked, and at the introduction of the horse, we adopted them into our culture as well. Because we did not have to forage as other native peoples did in these lands to live, we had leisure time to develop the arts, and we became known as great weavers, developing intricate baskets using many of the natural resources to provide those baskets. We were carvers. You can see our handiwork in the rocks and the caves of many of the ancient places here in Western Oregon. We became great storytellers. In our plank houses and in our lodges, we spent many hours visiting and holding potlatches and building relationships with our neighboring tribes. The area here was a very industrious area. We were known as great traders, and we conducted trades and not only interacted on the trade goods side, but we also learned that as a political maneuver, it was wise to marry into other chieftain families, and we did that as well. Soon after that, we experienced some change, and I might mention that Multnomah County is named after one of the primary chiefs of our tribe from the Chinook people, Chief Multnomah. And I know that I've been asked many times what that means. Well, it's a name. The Hudson Bay Company also had its influences in the early years, and contact was made then. I believe that it was representative of the rich culture and the natural resources that this area contained, because they were here to, I see Councilman Wink Sonnenberg coming in. Good afternoon, Wink. Who came here because of the abundance of beaver and otter. And it seemed like the intent at that time and the effect on the environment resulted in a depletion of those resources. There are now testing that's being undertaken now to determine whether there might be one otter that remains from the Oregon otters. To date, we have not found, along with all the scientists any other otters that were from this area. So it seemed to us like there was not a lot of attention that was paid to the environment and to the resources here, and a way to manage and to guard those resources were not in play. Stories from Hudson Bay workers state the abundance of salmon, the wildlife, the water, and there were stories about how thick the salmons were in these rivers. That one sentence depicted that they were so thick that you could walk across the backs of the salmon that were flowing in the Columbia and the Willamette rivers. And today we know that is not the case. We then moved to the Lewis and Clark era. During that time, the notations of Lewis and Clark are pretty prominent about what they seen when they came here. And they seen racks and racks of salmon that were hung along the rivers from our ancestors who lived in these areas and who thrived on those rich omega-3s that we now know are very essential to our diets. And they also assisted Lewis and Clark during a grave time of their experience when they were starving and didn't know how to live within the land itself. There was a major trade industry that was held here. The tribes learned how to negotiate and how to maintain their presence here along the Columbia and the Willamette River and throughout the other great rivers of Oregon, the Rogue River and the lower rivers that are down in southern Oregon. We then entered into the 1950s, which was the treaty-making era for tribes across the United States. The tribe was sent an Indian agent by the name of Joel Palmer. He negotiated with the tribes that are now composed of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. He was successful in establishing the peace treaties, and 7 treaties were ratified. Those treaties encompassed nearly the entire half of Oregon, almost all of western Oregon. They were the only treaties that were entered into by other tribes. We know that there are 9 tribes in Oregon, but the treaties that I'm talking about were only entered into with the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. The land that you now are sitting on were lands that were occupied and owned by the ancestors of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. These legal documents were made by the government to exchange our land so that we could have a place that we could live peaceably, that we were guaranteed health care, education, economic development opportunities. We then agreed that we would move and relocate to a coast reservation. That reservation was established on near the Pacific Ocean, where all of the tribes of Western Oregon, the native peoples, were herded to and placed there. We then were later moved, and the Grand Ronde Reservation was established in what is known now as our headquarters. Our life was forever altered because of those movements. The things that we depended upon and knew were changed because now the area that we were relocated in was somewhat foreign to us. We were also placed with other tribes who were known as our enemies or our rivals. We spoke different languages, we had different customs, we had different methods by where we lived and how we preserved our food, and our knowledge of the medicinal plants and the foliage and the flowers that were there were different. So a great adaptation had to occur for us to live what was now known as the Grand Ronde Reservation. Even during that time, there were some of our people who thought, well, I'm going to go back to where I came from. So many left, and they lived in the forests and where they could in other parts of Oregon so that they could continue to live in a place that was more familiar to them. Life then seemed to get harder as more settlers, miners, trappers, and timber lords came into Oregon territory. the face of Oregon was changed forever. We then went through that era until the termination era, and for tribes, not all tribes, there are about 560 Native American tribes in the United States experienced termination. There's a very few tribes that went through that process. Termination basically meant that all of the ties of the federal government to that Native American tribe was severed. They no longer were recognized as Indian people and as an Indian tribe. That happened to us in 1954, and for nearly 30 years without the recognition from the government as being Native Americans or Indian people, we lived as a landless people in our own area. We lived as an invisible people because we were not known as Indian or Native Americans anymore. But in 1983, after the work of many of our members, we were restored to federal recognition. And with it, all of the treaties that we had entered into, everything was restored except the land. All of the land in termination that was taken was still gone. The land that we retained was our cemetery located in Grand Ronde. And I continue to say that the wisdom of our ancestors and our elders continued to guide us and to call us so that we foraged ahead, so that we were restored again, and that we were once again a nation of people within a nation of people, and that we're a very proud, resilient people who adapts to change, and that we are survivors. After the Restoration era, we began to build our nation, and that brings us to the topic today. We are tied to the earth, that despite all of the laws and the policies that change things, in our hearts we're still tied to the earth. And we look at what has happened over a mere 200 years of occupation to this great land. That our system, or the tribal system for caring for the earth, was interrupted. Our presence was contemptible in this land. Our practices were scorned. We've seen the taking without providing for replenishment of the fish and wildlife, the allowance of overgrowth in the forests without the necessary fire-burning methods to inhibit disease and to control the balance of forest growth. We've seen clear cutting with no understanding that water temperatures were affected and that it was very detrimental to the fish and to the wildlife. We've seen that all the trees that were cut down produced undesirable effects that we all now have to live with, and hopefully we can all correct together. Wildlife was being reduced in their areas as clear cutting occurred, and their feeding grounds were eliminated. Water sources were dammed, disregarded, and polluted. Some of the principles that Native American tribes hold dear to them are to respect all living things, to give thanks, to live in harmony with the land, don't take more than you can use, and use all that you take. Plan for 7 generations, because we know that we all want our grandchildren and the grandchildren in the future to live in a happy, healthy place. There's a quote that I would like to read to you that I believe represents what we try to do. It says, "We must protect the forests for our children, grandchildren, and children yet to be born. We must protect the forests for those who can't speak for themselves, such as the birds, animals, fish, and trees." And I believe if we all adopted that as a philosophy and a practice, we would see a much better world. I just want to say in conclusion that the Confederated Tribes is working to correct some of these practices, and that healing would come to our environment and to the homelands of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. I believe we all have a responsibility to see our environment healed. We need to put our ideas, plans, and commitment to environmental healing. We need to be inspired to lead this world to a better place. And with those remarks, I'll turn it over to Lisa Bluelake.
Thank you, Chairwoman Kennedy, and thank you for the City Club for having me here today. It's hard to follow the chairwoman, so she's so eloquent, but I'll do my best to follow in her footsteps. Chairwoman Kennedy spoke about the tribe's termination and its restoration in 1983. As the tribe rebuilds its reservation and its relationships with other governments following restoration, strong environmental stewardship remains one of the strong focuses of the tribe, both on and off the reservation. The stewardship includes protection, enhancement of habitat for wildlife, plants, and fish species such as salmon, lamprey, and sturgeon, and also includes protection of cultural resources such as ancestral remains, village sites that Cheryle was referring to, and other sacred sites throughout Oregon. And my goal today is to give you a few examples of what the tribe has been doing in terms of environmental stewardship, both on and off the reservation. And as a backdrop to that, I'd like to add a few more remarks about the tribe's history, which impacts its rights and responsibilities in the area of environmental stewardship. Following termination, as Chairwoman mentioned, the tribe lost all of its lands except for the cemetery. And then when the tribe was restored in '83, it didn't have a reservation, and many of its efforts were to regain its reservation. In order to do that, it had to work with state and local governments to try to get their agreement to restore to a reservation. And as part of that, the tribe was compelled to enter in a consent decree which limited the tribe's treaty fishing and hunting rights in order to get the state's consent. And so that currently the tribe, pursuant to the consent decree, the tribe's treaty rights are, instead of being throughout its ceded lands, which Chairwoman mentioned, as much of Western Oregon, are limited to an area called the Trask Unit, which includes a section of the Willamette Basin and also part of the coast area, including the current reservation and also up to the north and west of the reservation. Also part of the consent decree was that the state would have fish and wildlife jurisdiction on the reservation. And to understand what was going on at the time, during termination era, the state of Oregon was working with the tribes of the Columbia River that were asserting treaty rights and were challenging the state's authority to regulate fish and the tribe's use of fish on the Columbia. And so when the western tribes were starting to get restored, and it started with Siletz in the 70s, the state was wrestling with those issues, and it wanted to ensure that as the tribes in the western Oregon were restored, that it didn't have to wrestle with those issues in western Oregon as well. And so unfortunately the tribe, in order to get any land back, which was one of the focuses and goals of restoration, had to limit some of their treaty rights. Another result of termination was that we had a much smaller land base, and the tribe is now acre by acre trying to restore that land base, and that takes a lot of effort, whereas a lot of the other tribes in Oregon who did not have a reduced reservation or reservation taken away have a great land base. In addition, another impact of termination was that there's an uphill battle to educate the people of Oregon and the federal and state agencies as to the role of Grand Ronde and its history. During the termination era, there were a lot of environmental laws that were enacted, that including the Northwest Power Act, the Columbia River Gorge Scenic Act, National Environmental Policy Act, National Historic Preservation Act, all these laws which provided for consultation with tribes throughout the United States, but in particular tribes in Oregon. And so as federal and state agencies were calling tribes to the table to consult with those projects, Grand Ronde wasn't present because of the termination and the lack of federal recognition. So the result is that a lot of the agencies attributed interest in the Willamette Basin to those tribes, and Grand Ronde, and didn't know anything about the Grand Ronde or Grand Ronde's rights or Grand Ronde's history. So since restoration, the tribe's been working to develop the relationships with federal and state agencies and the community, and to take advantage of forums like this to educate people about Grand Ronde's interest in these areas and Grand Ronde's history. And then since restoration, the tribe is also working real heavily to increase staff at the tribe, both in the area of natural resources and cultural resources, to be able to go out and participate in consultations and to engage in these discussions. And that we have a strong natural resources department that also includes a position of a ceded lands coordinator, which helps coordinate all the activities in the ceded lands, which, as Chairwoman Kennedy mentioned, it covered the whole Willamette Basin and all the way down I-5 corridor to California. So there's a lot of activities going on in this area. And he coordinates the environmental staff and the cultural staff in our tribal attorney's office to engage in activities. Most of these efforts are funded through the tribe's casino, the gaming revenues from the casino. So it's very important to the tribe. These revenues have done wonders for Grand Ronde. Also, I just wanted to point out that the tribe's community fund is also provided grants to a number of conservation organizations in Western Oregon. In fact, I had asked our community director for some statistics in that regard, and I got this printout of 142 grants, I think, that amounted to about $5 million. So that's tribe's efforts and some background that I wanted to mention before I talk about some specific areas that the tribe has been involved with, and both on and off reservation. And I'm going to try not to go into too much detail about the specific projects, but I just want to give everyone an idea of the variety of projects that the tribe's involved in. On res, the tribe, as I mentioned, a consent decree limited the tribe's treaty hunting and fishing rights. And that consent decree also limited the tribe's right to hunt big game to the seasons that were open for citizens of Oregon. And so the state approached the tribe, the tribe approached the state and said that, well, we have important ceremonies and funerals and the like that occur outside of that season. And we'd like to work with you to get some additional rights and privileges to hunt big game outside of those seasons. So the state recognized the tribe's need for big game for those ceremonies, and also recognized the tribe's reputation for strong stewardship of big game. So they actually worked with the tribe and developed a state rule that provided for the tribe to have ceremonial hunts outside of the regular big game season. And that is an example of the relationship between the state and the tribe, and the ability to rectify, in some respect, past injustices. And so that's a relatively recent thing, and the tribe's still taking advantage of those and of providing a lot of fresh meat at its ceremonies. In conjunction with that effort, the tribe and the state talked about the Grand Ronde's desire to take back more regulatory authority over fish and game on the reservation. And then in August of 2007, the tribe and the state signed a proclamation that would, where they would work to provide additional authority to the tribe to manage fish and wildlife on the res. As I mentioned, the consent decree had given a lot of that to the state, but there was, since restoration, this understanding that the tribe was able to regulate that on their own. And so the state recognized that, and on February 20th, 2008, Grand Ronde adopted an interim Grand Ronde Fish and Wildlife Management Plan, which was recognized by the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission by resolution. And then now the tribe is currently developing a permanent fish and wildlife management plan, which will include tribal decisions on game and habitat management on the reservation. Along with the state conservation plans, the tribe also has a natural resource management plan that is approved by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. That is a multiple use management plan on the reservation. It balances forestry practices, recreation, and habitat protection. The goal of there's many goals in the management plan, just to name a few. There's a goal to have 1,000 acres in late successional habitat. And it's giving you an idea, the reservation that was restored to Grand Ronde is about 10,000 acres. So we have 1/10 of it in late successional habitat. There's a lot of stream enhancement projects, including inserting large woody debris in the streams, and also doing replacements of culverts. There's also a goal of having 100 acres of meadows for deer and elk. And it includes threatened and endangered species surveys. So whenever there's timber or road building projects, the tribe will survey whether or not any endangered species such as the northern spotted owl, the winter steelhead, or marbled murrelet are impacted. In addition, another area in the line of threatened endangered species, the tribe has a lot of threatened Nelson's checker mallow on its reservation. And years ago, in an effort to start developing some of the tribe's reservation, and there's some, in addition to the forest land, there's some other areas where the casino sits and where the tribal government sits, in housing and the health center and the education center on the reservation, where in order to develop some of these buildings for the tribe's infrastructure, they had some issues with Nelson's checker mallow. So they agreed with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to develop a management plan where they actually have about 5 reserves on the reservation, where if they transplant checker mallow from non-reserve areas on the reservation to these reserve areas to preserve that threatened species. Tribe also engages a number of water quality monitoring activities on the reservation. And then since 2007, the tribe has operated a fish weir to study and monitor the runs of fall coho and listed winter steelhead on Agency Creek. And Agency Creek is a tributary of the South Yamhill River in the Willamette Subbasin. And interestingly enough, some of the data that has come out of the operation of this fish weir is that Agency Creek represents less than 1/3 of 1% of the entire Willamette Subbasin. However, the tribe gets about 3% of the fall coho coming up through the fish weir. And this is according to 2008 and 2009 data collected at the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife's fish ladder at Willamette Falls compared to the fish counts at the weir. So it appears that an unrepresentative percentage of the fish are returning to the Grand Ronde Reservation. And the tribe likes to think of that as the fish are attracted to the better than average management practices on the reservation. Another, that percentage is even more startling, and can you consider that these fish, these anadromous species, are traveling 250 miles from the Pacific Ocean to get to the reservation. They have basically an inverted or a sideways sea coming from the Pacific Ocean, going down the Willamette, through the Yamhill, and there's quite a ways for them to travel. And with that, I'll go to the some off-reservation examples of the tribe's stewardship efforts. Starting with Portland Harbor, many of you may be aware that there's a super fun site here in Portland, and the tribe serves on the trustee council for that Superfund site. And the trustee council is a group of governments that speak or work for the public in restoring the natural resources that were impacted by the release of contaminants in Portland Harbor. There are 8 governments on the Natural Resource Trustee Council, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA, the state of Oregon, acting through the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and 5 tribes: Grand Ronde, Siletz, Umatilla, Warm Springs, and Nez Perce. The tribe is also heavily involved in the cleanup side of the Portland Harbor, which is managed by an Environmental Protection Agency. There is a MOU between the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Environmental Quality, and the 8 trustees that provide a mechanism for the tribe and the other parties to work with EPA on identifying data gaps and reviewing the cleanup data that's been done so far. And this, I know from experience, because I just came from 2 Portland Harbor meetings this week, that it's a very time-intensive project. And I've been working on it for about 8 years, and Steve Kelly in the room, who used to be an attorney with Grand Ronde, worked on it for a number of years before me. So it's been a big project, and it's an important project for Portland to clean up and make the river healthy again. I'll also point out that City of Portland, who is one of the potential responsible parties in the Portland Harbor Superfund site, has been a very good partner for both with EPA and the tribes and with the Natural Resource Trustee Council. It's taking a lot of responsibility and effort to try to clean up the river and develop restoration opportunities with the trustees. Another issue related to Portland Harbor is the fish consumption rate. The tribal members of Grand Ronde, like Native Americans throughout the country, consume much higher rates of fish than average Americans, and therefore are subject to higher levels of risk from toxic contamination in fish. And because of that, in 2004, the Tribal Council adopted a resolution encouraging EPA to use fish consumption rates appropriate to tribal consumers in their decisions for cleanup, determining cleanup levels and approving water quality standards and issuing other permits. And in fact, EPA in the Portland Harbor Superfund site has adopted 175 grams per day fish consumption rate, which I know that might not have a lot of meaning to some, but the state of Oregon's current fish consumption rate that it uses is 17.5 grams per day. So that's tenfold the current Oregon rate. And recently, in 2007, the tribe joined an effort led by the Umatilla tribe to actually encourage the state of Oregon to increase their fish consumption rate. And Cheryle Kennedy and other Grand Ronde members have testified before the Environmental Quality Commission on this issue, and the Environmental Quality Commission has actually directed DEQ to pursue rulemaking for changing the fish consumption rate from 17.5 grams to 175 grams. And so hopefully as both the federal government and the state government make cleanup decisions and other decisions impacting fish, those decisions will consider the large amount of fish that tribal members eat in the state of Oregon. Another project that's related to Portland Harbor and it's in the Portland area is the Willamette Falls hydroelectric project. The members of the Grand Ronde have gathered lamprey at Willamette Falls for generations. And there's currently PG has a dam there that was subject to relicensing by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission back in the earlier part of the 200s 2000, excuse me, and in 2004, a settlement agreement was entered between Grand Ronde, PGE, and a number of other federal and state agencies and a few other tribes that addressed lamprey passage over the falls and other lamprey preservation points, and then also access to the falls for harvest. And the lamprey are a species that is not as well glamorous, not as glamorous as salmon, and so there's a lot of studying that has not been done on lamprey, and that was one of the efforts for the hydroelectric licensing, was to find out more about lamprey and its life stages. And the tribe is involved with that through the relicensing, and also has engaged in lamprey studies on its own. Currently is involved in a radio telemetry study in collaboration with Oregon State University, which started in 2006 and will continue through 2012. And that's where they are tagging lamprey at Willamette Falls and releasing them above the falls. And then there are tagging stations throughout all of the tributaries of the Willamette. And so as these lamprey migrate through the areas, the tribe and OSU is identifying, where they're going and when they're going, and it's providing a lot of information on the life cycle of the lamprey, and will help in future conservation efforts considering the lamprey. Let's see how much time I have here. Looks like I am out of time. Is that correct? Okay, so there's just more projects than I can tell you about that the tribe is involved with when it comes to environmental stewardship, and it is making up ground from the time when it was terminated. I believe it's doing a good job, and we hope to do a better job and learn and help others learn more about the tribe and its efforts. I appreciate your time, and thank you.
The first question for our speaker, as always, will be from our Friday Forum host, and our host today is City Club Governor Promise King. Promise is the executive director of Oregon League of Minority Voters, and also wrote on race and politics as a columnist for the Portland Tribune. He's been a City Club member since 2008. Promise?
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you. Chairman Sharon, you told us of a history that is vivid, courageous, and yet rooted in dehumanization and debasement. My question is, have you been able to forgive the past? What do you think the state should do to mitigate those injustices?
I appreciate your question. As I stated earlier, that the peoples of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde are a resilient people, a people who are adaptable, who plan for the future, and who incorporate new methods and ideas, as we adopted the horse, as we adopted the metals and the introduction of other materials that would improve and make our lives more efficient. We've been able to do that. I believe that in the healing process, as we look at the environment and seek ways of healing the environment, we also need to seek ways of healing our souls. And that's on both sides. Once the state of Oregon, the federal government, the peoples of the United States embrace the healing process as we have, I believe we'll all be better people because of it. So as far as forgiveness, we find in our heart that we're able to live with our neighbors, we're able to share. It's part of our responsibility to this earth to share what we have and to help build a better life for all of us. So yes, in looking forward, we do look forward to a time when all of the difficulties that we have incurred will be healed in our own hearts, and they will be far distant memories for us.
Thank you.
We will now take questions from the floor. Asking questions at Friday forums is typically a privilege of City Club membership, but because we have folks here today that are some more guests today, I'd like to open it up for anyone who'd like to come up and ask a question. You go ahead and stand up over here by the microphone. Before asking your question, please identify yourself and ask your question in 30 seconds or less. Thank you.
Can I comment too? Gilly Burlingham, City Club member. I lived on Seneca land, in the land of the Haudenosaunee for many years. And bless you if you can forgive the intruders. My real question is, my understanding of all the native tribes is that they had no concept of land ownership. You don't own your mother. Do you have any tradition or stories about how this incredible idea of having private land property, how did this finally penetrate the minds of the wonderful people who lived here and had no real concept of actually private ownership of Mother Earth?
We look at the responsibility for stewardship of the land, I believe is all our responsibility. When we look at the earth, our job is to take care of it, is to leave it better than when we first was introduced to it. So I guess as far as society is nowadays, we know and learn that the concept of owning is really a stewardship that we take seriously. So, but there are transactions. We do live in this United States, and there are real estate property agreements and purchases, and all of those things take place. But when we do own something, it is to be responsible for it and to leave it better than when we received it.
Roger Meyer, City Club member. I would like to ask both of you how it's going with the partnership with the political entities and the tribes and Billy Franks and the Fishery Commission. It seems to me that's an illustration of not only forgiveness but of forward progress if it is maintained. And I'm really concerned about the fisheries because it seems to be striking at the heart of all of the tribal cultures in the West.
I'll just provide a comment and then turn it over to Lisa. Billy Frank is a great warrior for Native American people throughout the world. Fighting for indigenous rights and for our way of life is something that, as tribal leaders, we all do. We stand together in those kind of fights and have high regard for Mr. Frank. We believe, again, that as Native Americans, when our ways are preserved and when they're protected, our lives will be better. But again, it will also be better on the state officials, on the federal officials, when they recognize, as they now recognize practices that we used and employed for thousands of years. As I mentioned earlier in my remarks, I talked about the fire burning method for keeping the forest rich and thriving and ridding itself of disease. That practice is now being recognized and embraced by all environmentalists and by the Forest Service. So in the same way, I believe we need to move forward.
I'll just add one remark to that, is using the Portland Harbor example. As I mentioned, there's a number of tribes that are involved in that effort, and the 5 tribes that are involved actually have a joint contractor, and we meet as a tribal group to develop what our tribal position is and how we're going to work together to encourage EPA to adopt strong cleanup standards, and also how the trustee council is going to move forward. And we have a lot of differences as far as what each other's rights are, maybe in the area, but we put those aside for the benefit of the resource.
Kurt Wabering, member. First, I'd like to thank you very much for coming and sharing your wisdom with us. I was involved with a group that was called the Eco-Forestry Institute, and they mentioned, and we learned at that time about many of the practices that you suggest, natural forest burning and multi-age stands of forests and so forth. But my question is a little bit different. There is a ballot measure, which I believe the City Club will be studying about gaming, and which would basically allow, I believe, wider use of gaming, and I wonder how that would affect the tribe and its casino.
First, let me say that I think the real difference in gaming, I know we often get asked similar type questions, is that the laws provide for tribes to enter into gaming compacts. The regulation of those compacts, of course, is by a federal group, and the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde is a self-regulating group, and it required a lot of stringent adherence and demonstration that we were able to have that designation. There are only 2 tribes in the United States that have that designation. But the impacts on a private company entering into gaming, I believe, is a big dilemma for the state of Oregon. I guess in the minds and the hearts of Oregonians, I'm wondering if they would approve of one company financed from another country, if that's the right thing to do. But the impacts that would have on the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Spirit Mountain are devastating. That's not a secret. Our revenues would be diminished by more than half. And the operation of our government is based upon the revenues that are generated by the casino. Termination had an awful effect for us. It took everything that we had, took all of our land and our resources, and so every acre that we get, we buy back. Our tribe, again, as I mentioned, is the largest tribe in Oregon. There were promises made in the treaty-making era that guaranteed health care, education, and other things. In our treaties, we went to the National Archives back in November, and we looked at our treaties, and every one of the 7 treaties said that they would provide a hospital for us, doctors, medicine, a schoolhouse, teachers, all of those things. None of them were ever realized. The exchange of our land for those promises, we still hold that the federal government has a responsibility that they must live up to if they want to be the honorable government that we know that they can be. And so all of our dollars, we have stepped up. We might be one of the only tribes in the United States that we provide health care for all of our members, no matter where they live. That's an obligation that the government said they would do for us. They said that Indian Health Service, the federal agency, would do that for us, and they don't. They partially do that. And so the effect that it would have, not just, just on one item alone is our health care. So you ask about the impact. Yes, it's huge.
Don Williams, City Club member. This is a question for Lisa. Lisa, you did a great job describing as an attorney some of the issues you deal with from the natural resources and environmental standpoint, but could you talk about some of the other critical legal issues that you deal with, be they jurisdictional, transportation, funding, et cetera?
Well, as one of 5 in-house counsel, we deal with a variety of issues, and each one of us has a little bit of a specialty in area, but we, between the 5 of us, we cover probably 99% of all the legal issues that the tribe deals with. So me in particular, I do a lot with the gaming regulatory area, which Chairwoman Kennedy mentioned that the Tribes Gaming Commission is one of the strongest gaming regulatory bodies in the country, and is recognized as that. So I work with them a great deal, and in efforts to keep gaming regulation as the primary role of the tribe, we have to work consistently with the federal agency and the state who also regulate Indian gaming, and try to preserve the tribe's primary right to regulate it. And so that's one example. Another example is I work heavily with enrollment and the challenges that come when you have requirements to enroll, and how that impacts families when one member is eligible and not another. Then I also work with Indian child welfare with the state and federal or tribal courts. We have tribe as a tribal court, which hears many matters, including Indian child welfare cases. And then, boy, it's just, we have agreements with local governing bodies such as the fire district to provide fire services on the reservation, and with our Polk County to provide police services on the reservation. Because of the makeup of the tribe's reservation, it's kind of scattered parcels except for the primary piece of the forest land. We have a lot of issues with where we have fee land and tribal land and checkerboard areas where we have jurisdiction is either is with a tribe, it's on trust land, but if it's a couple 100 yards away, it's fee land and it's the county or it's a state. And so those issues provide interesting legal issues, and deal with those on a daily basis.
I often don't get a chance to ask a question, Sharon Van Sickle Robbins, but I would like to ask, we talked about environmental stewardship, we talked about healthcare. What kinds of efforts are the tribes making with respect to education?
We sit here very proud to state that any of our members who wish to pursue a higher education degree can do so. We make the gaming revenues available for all of our youth and our children, adults alike, to further their education. We're a strong believer in education. We believe it is the key to self-sufficiency, not only for the tribe, but also for every individual member.
My question is somewhat two parts. One is, I'm curious where your people are living, as far as how many are on the reservation and off the reservation, and what efforts you're doing to sort of revive and bring back your culture and your language. I can imagine that it's sort of been devastated over so many years of being spread to the four winds. And then my second question is sort of related to that, is have you achieved a tribal fishing season on the Willamette? And is that a goal of yours?
Well, I will speak to the culture question. Culture and restoration, you're right. When termination happened, and even before termination, the various land acts that occurred for tribes resulted in a diminishment of our land base, and of course the population scattered and continued to scatter. Once the reservation was completely gone in the 50s, tribal members moved across the whole United States and into other countries. So on restoration, the bringing back and the gathering of the wisdom of our members, there were a handful that stayed there at Grand Ronde, and the cultural part of it is building. The tribe has invested the gaming revenues into the language program. It's an immersion language program at Grand Ronde that is developed there for our children and for adults if they wish to participate. We are regaining more fluent speakers. The artifacts and the restoration of articles that we used, songs and dances are being revived as well. There are forums in Portland. We have an office here in Portland, one in Eugene as well, whereby we host classes for our people to learn the ways that that sometimes are hard to find, but we find that there are members who retain that knowledge, so we do that work. We are in the throes of establishing a museum, which would be to preserve our artifacts. We're working hard at collecting artifacts from various sources, universities, museums, and private collections, so it is a priority for us.
We have unfortunately run out of time for further questions and that final answer this week, so we'll have to stop. Join us next week on July 30th for an exploration of whether we need a regional bridge authority and a celebration of Portland's Bridge Festival. And this will be our final Friday forum before our August break. As we close, please join me in expressing our appreciation to today's guests, Cheryle Kennedy and Lisa Bluelake. We're adjourned.